One day with Brian helping his dad with the car when they noticed a moving truck pull up the next door. And they were supposed to have new neighbors since the old couple who lived there moved out only about a few weeks earlier. And so Brian and his dad walked up to the new neighbors to introduce themselves. There was this woman in her mid 30s, which has a daughter, but around the same age as Brian, about 16. And the woman introduced herself as Karen and her daughter Ellen. Then Brian's dad actually had introduced them himself and welcomed to the neighborhood. And Karen said that she was really happy to move this new place and that she was really feeling excited to move to a new small town. And she actually did mention that she and her daughter had moved here because she had recently been promoted, and that they were going to open a new office in this particular town, and that she was going to be the one to run it. And she was excited about this promotion. They were only leading me for one problem though. They had to move to this particular town, even though that Ellen, which her mom Karen did mention that she didn't even want to move, because that would mean that she had to say goodbye to her old friends back home. Ellen had tried to convince her mother why not they had to try to stay here and that she can travel back and forward or maybe buy some small apartment for herself in that town and work there during the weekends and go back home for the weekends. The weekdays and go back during the weekends. Even that her mom was not very much happy about that idea, Karen said while smiling. Even though Brian tried to introduce himself to Ellen, she shook his hand, but she didn't answer much. She says, with almost like a whisper, that her name was Ellen. Karen did say that her daughter was quite shy to new people, and Brian didn't mind because he did say that he used to be quite shy when he was younger, but he even then was introduced by Stop his father and asked, "What about if we can take Ella around in the neighborhood to show her around? Maybe that so that she could find some places easier. Maybe to find the high school easier, and at least on some of the more close areas." And Karen actually thought it was a good idea, even though Ella didn't want to go first. But Karen did mention that it was best for her to try to at least give it a try. So, and luckily though, Ellen agreed. So Brian and Ellen walked together on the sidewalk. Even though at first it was quite silent between them. Brian did mention that he was born in this town and has always lived here, and that he was going to the local high school that was only a short distance from where he lived. Ellen did mention also that she was going to start in this school after since the summer break was over, and Karen Brian was actually a little bit excited to have a new friend, perhaps maybe a new friend to start in school, and he actually showed her around in the neighborhood to the playground or convenience store around the corner, and even took her to the high school and showed her where the different places are, like gym class are, where she can find the entrance are, some of the places. Even though that Ellen was just want to go back home and help her mother, but she started to enjoy his company. And after about several days, they actually had become good friends. Even though that Brian had invited her over to maybe watch a movie or maybe play games like that, video games. And even that only after about a week, school had started again. And Brian actually had asked Ellen if she wanted to have his company back to school with him in the mornings, just for the company. And at first she was a little bit shy about that, but she agreed. And after about at least about several days, things was actually started to open up for her more. When she has only been in school for about at least for about 3 days, she had immediately had almost new friends. Even though that she missed her old friends, but she had made at least plenty of new friends, and she was happy about that. And her mother Karen could notice that she was happy. She had made new friends, despite that she can be shy from time to time though. But at least she had a grateful thanks to Brian because he was the one who introduced some of his friends to her and she made good friends with them. And it happened after the first week of school, they all together decided to hang out at the park. Just to have some friendly games or maybe just hang out and just spend time. But then there were this guy as that Brian knew from school, but he wasn't really friend with him, but it was just someone he knew about. By the name Lucas. Lucas was actually a decent good guy and he was actually playing football in the school team and he had a lot of friends. And he asked Brian if he knew if Ellen was single. And Brian said that he really doesn't even know if she has a long distance boyfriend or she's single because she has only moved here about a week earlier. But Brian didn't ask why he was so curious about that because it turned out Lucas had fallen in love with her and wanted to ask her out. But he was a little bit shy to do so, and even though that Brian said, well, go for it. I mean, doesn't hurt to ask. So Lucas walked up to Ella and asked her out. And she said yes immediately because she even thought that he was quite handsome and quite good looking for a 16-year-old. And it turned out that this as a good idea for her because for the next couple of weeks, things between her and Lucas turned out to be a perfect moment. It was like a great time. They were actually having a great time as a couple. She even had introduced herself, Lucas, to her mother, and she was actually very happy to see a well mannered, handsome young man that he is. And he was athletic, play sports, and but all of this happened was a good time. It was also a good moment in her life. Even Brian and Ellen had even also been getting closer as friends. They usually helped each other with homeworks or maybe just hang out from time to time. And she mentioned to Brian about her and Lucas are being dating together and how things are between them, how she feels happy, so feel so much in love with him. Even though that she asked Brian or some things about Lucas, well, like some things he like to do, and what she will do for him as a gift or something like that. Even though that Brian didn't know uh, Lucas personally much, but only some things that he learned from some other his friends, like he liked to do sports and other things. And her happiness was a great for even for Brian. He realized that she seems to be more happier when she was Lucas. But unfortunately, after nearly about almost before prom, Lucas had had hoping Ellen had hoped that Lucas would ask her out to the prom. But only about a week earlier, or only about 1 week before the prom, Lucas mentioned something to Ellen that he had no longer any feelings for her, and he didn't want to be with her anymore, and hoped that they could still be friends. But Ellen said no, and she was devastated. And this took place just right during the lunch break. And Ellen, she was so devastated. Even with Brian, he was standing with some of his friends when he heard a girl crying and saw that Ellen ran past him, crying. He was shocked. He has never seen her cry over the time he's known her. And he told his friends that he would be back soon, and he just got to shake up on Ellen to see if she was okay. She ran all the way to the girls' locker room or the bathroom, but since he couldn't even go in there, he knocked on the door and it was open just a bit jar and asked if she was okay. if she wanted to talk. But she said no, she really doesn't want to be alone. So he agreed, but he said, if you want to talk, you know where to find me, and at least I'm here for you to help you with anything you need to help with. Even though that she had said thanks, and then he left. But that was the last time he saw her that day, though, at school, because after that he had left, she went to find her teacher and told her that she didn't feel well and that she wanted to go home. And the teacher said, "All right," since it was only half a day left, so she agreed to that. But that was not the only thing, though, because that was almost only shortly afterwards when Alan went home. Brian find out what was happened. Some of the girls who was close to Alan actually overheard that Lucas broke up with her, and he was even mad at Lucas because sometimes that things happens. Even though Brian himself had a girlfriend about a year earlier, that didn't work out either so well. So he could understand from the perspective that Alan wanted to have some time off, some space. So he likely agreed to do so. And when he was about at his door at home after school, he was greeted by Alan. Alan was sitting outside his door on a bench and asking if she could come inside, and he agreed. So they went to the kitchen. He asked if she wanted something to drink or eat. She just wanted some water. So they sat down. Even though that Brian was quiet first, he tried to ask how she felt because, and he then also mentioned he knew what happened. He overheard some other girls mention to him what happened, and that made her cry again. And he did mention that he also had a girlfriend only about a year earlier, which didn't work out. But but then she cried even more and says she had hoped to go with Lucas to the prom because this would be her very first prom with a boyfriend, and she had been so much in love with him. But then Brian thought about something and asked, "What about if I took you to the prom as your date? But we can still go as friends if you want it, but still as your date." And she looked up at him, tearful eyes, and said, "Would you really do that? For me?" "Of course," Brian said. "I mean, you are really a beautiful girl, and you're kind, and anyone could see that how much you are in such pain right now at the moment. But I will always be there. And after all, I don't even have asked anyone. I had tried to ask some girls in school, but I always had said, and I had said, oh no, for an answer. They had always found someone else to be with. If I had go to the prom, I'd be alone. So, so I ask you though, if you want to go with me as your date to the prom." And even though that Alan realized maybe that was not a bad idea. After all, Brian has been so kind to her. And even that they weren't going as an official couple, but as friends as a date. So she agreed. So they continued the small talk, and after about an hour, she had to say go back home because she had to do some homeworks, and she was just happy. But that same evening, when Brian was on his bed, he got a text message from Ellen. She smiled, said that she was happy to that he would take her to the prom, and she was looking forward to it. And he said that he was also. And but then he realized, even despite they had only known each other for only a short time, for only a couple of months, he had fallen in love with her. But he has never even realized until that moment he had fallen in love with Ellen. But he didn't want to have to ruin their new friendship because he didn't even know if she would like him back in the same way because he thought maybe she likes him as a type, like a brother type figure, and he didn't want to ruin that. So he didn't mention this to her in a text message or in person. But the next day, there was a Friday, and Brian didn't feel that next. He didn't feel so well, so he was allowed to stay home from by his dad, So Brian spent most of his day by watching some movies or playing games or resting on his own bed. But during that time, he still thought much about Ellen. But there was something about her that it made him realize he had actually fallen in love with her. He didn't know exactly how much things between them would work out because even that he usually thought how things between her and himself would work out. But he wanted to tell her, so he decided to maybe tell her on the prom date. And when the prom night came, though, he walked up to her home, and when he saw her in a blue dress, it took his breath out. Brian was amazed how beautiful she were in the blue dress. He even mentioned how beautiful she were, and she just smiled and blushed a lot, though. And even at the dance, Brian and Ellen had a great time. They danced a lot, talked on their friends, even though that Ellen did see Lucas, but he had no date with her or with him. He went alone, and even though he danced with some other girls, but nothing as much as a official date, but he was actually not as a player type either. He would just ask some of the girls if they want to dance with him. If they said no, he didn't bother to ask them anymore. But after the prom had taken place, when Brian and Ellen was waiting for Brian's dad to pick them up, he then asked if she had any crush on someone else in school or if she would consider being dating someone else. Just a some random question though, trying to break the silence between them. And she said that she probably would date some other guy for school, but she had no idea who. And he then mentioned by randomly if she would date him, just also to try to figure out if she had any particular type of guy she preferred to dating. And she did say that she would probably date Brian, but she never thought about it. Even though that she thinks he's quite handsome, even that probably the most handsome guy in school, well, after Lucas though, but she probably would have taken him as a boyfriend if he had feelings for her. That surprised Brian a bit though, but he wanted to tell her, but right then Brian's dad appeared in car, and even that he would just want to wait, he asked his dad if he could wait for a moment, but never did. But as they were standing outside Alan's home, only a few moments later, Brian dad actually said that he had strong feelings for her, and that was the reason why he had asked her if she would date him. That surprised her, but he even said if she needed time to think about if they would even consider being in a romantic involved relationship. So she said yes, but she will need at least maybe think about overnight. And he agreed. And even that night though, Brian he couldn't even sleep much because he was worried and even curious what the answer from Ellen would be by the next day. And the very next day, when Brian went to see Ellen, she had walked him inside, and then she said that she would date him because after figure out, try to even think and consider how lucky she had when they encountered him. So Brian then asked her out on a date to maybe to the movies. And since there was a Friday, since it was a Saturday, both agreed to go to the movies the same day. But they had no idea what movies were showing. So they went to the movies about 4 p.m. and there they saw it was some a horror movie, comedy movie, and even some romance movie. Even though the bride was not much in for romance, but he would sacrifice himself to be handled to watch that movie. But it turned out Ellen preferred to watch the comedy, which both of them actually agreed to do so. And it was a perfect choice. Both of them had such great time. Both laughed a lot, and even after the movie was over, or maybe as an hour later, they talked about it afterwards. They walked all the way back home and they talked a lot about it. They talked about which parts was funniest and what about the characters and which parts was not so that funny and which parts was the worst and some of the best parts. And Brian, he felt like he hit the jackpot. He had not only been on his first date after a year, but also had gained a new girlfriend. But he really hoped that this relationship might last a bit longer, even despite knowing if they couldn't, maybe not. But he was willing to try to make it last as long as possible. Even though that they had announced their relationship to their parents, to his dad and her mom, both were actually very excited. And it turned out not only after that, they had so much great time together, so much in common, and they realized they were meant to be with each other. It was only to take some time after her breakup with Lucas to realize she had feelings for Brian and that he had feelings for her. And even when Christmas arrived, they actually had Brian and with his dad had invited over Karen and Ellen to celebrate it with them, which was a great idea. And they had no idea this would be one of many Christmas they would celebrate together for many years onwards. And during the summer, the next year, things between Brian and Ellen has only get stronger. They never fight about anything. But one day, when Brian had been asked by Ellen if he wanted to go on a hike with her, but he said that he couldn't because he had to help around at home because his dad had some bad accident. So she did fine so that he would say maybe next time. She gave him a kiss and she had went on a hike with her friend Linda. Linda and Ella went to the forest nearby outside town on car drive. But they did notice that this was supposed to be in a bad weather on approaching, so they decided to make it a short hike. But as they were on the hike, though, the rain started first slowly, but after about maybe as 20 minutes or so, it was pouring down, and it was started blowing as a wind. Apparently, there was a big storm, or at least some bad weather on the approaching, and they didn't know idea what to do because they had to walk back to the car, but doing so, they would have no idea which direction to go because the rain was pouring so badly down they couldn't even barely see their own, at least maybe a feet in front of them. So they tried to figure out a place to stay, but then, as Ellen walked along the path with Linda, she stepped wrong and she fell down the hill. And it happened a split second. Linda, she didn't know what happened because there was thunder, at least some thunder in the sky in that masked the sound of Ellen falling down the hill. She tried to scream for for Linda, but Linda could even hear her because of the thunder. And Ellen, she rolled down the hill and hit her head on against a big stump or tree or something and fell unconscious. But Linda, she used to continue walking. She believed that Ellen was just only behind her. But after nearly maybe as 10 minutes to 15 minutes of walking, she turned around because she didn't hear Ellen anymore. Even despite the thunder was going on from time to time, she would turn around to see if she was even behind her anymore. But she wasn't. She had no idea where she had been took where she disappeared too. She tried to run up the hill, screaming for Ellen. She screamed, "Ellen, where are you?" But no answer, only the thunder in the distance. The rain was pouring down, and despite the have no visibility to see, almost like not as a feet in front of her, she had no idea what to do. The only option she had called for help, but she realized she forgot her phone in the car. The only option she was she had only two options. One, continue to look for Alan, or two, run back to the car to find it and call for an emergency 911 for find Ellen. And she decided the latter. She ran back as fast as she could to the car, despite the path being muddy, and she tripped several times, but she didn't care. All she wanted to find her best friend. And she ran to the car. After nearly 5 to 10 minutes, she arrived. And she was panicking because she had no idea how badly injured Alan could have been or where she ended up to. Because she didn't even know if she was in seriously injured or she had walked a different way from her. Because she didn't even know if she was hurt or not. But she didn't want to take that big risk. She called for 911, and after nearly maybe 10 minutes or maybe 15, 20 minutes, they arrived. Police, fire departments arrived if they needed any. Even she had even called for Brian. Brian, I was in the living room back home, just watching some news, and when his phone rang and it said Linda. Linda and Brian were actually good friends. They had known each other since fifth grade. But when he picked up, she was like screaming, panicking on the phone. It's like, "Whoa, Linda, calm down. What's happening? Oh, where are you?" And she explained that she was in the forest. Well, in near the forest, and that Lind Ellen had disappeared. She was vanished, and she had no idea. She was panicking that she had lost her best friend in the forest. And he asked, "Have you called for help?" And she said yes. And he didn't know what exactly to do. But Linda told them not to come back, not to ride to the forest, to stay home. She called for an update, and then to hang up. Brian then went to to Karen, who's also home, but she was not aware of what happened. She told Karen, and he told Karen, and she was freaking out. She wanted to go to to see if she could find her daughter, but she didn't. Brian managed to convince her to stay home because the bad weather was happening and that the fire department's ambulance, police was already there. There was nothing much they could do and just wait. And since Karen didn't have Linda's phone number, but Brian had. So Brian decided to stay with Karen for any update and any sort of further update from Linda. Back in the forest, Linda was still at the entrance of the forest for tracking the hill from the hiking trail, but what she didn't know, Alan had suddenly woken up from her injury, and she was disoriented. She was dizzy, and at first she didn't know what happened, but it took only a few seconds. And after that, she realized what had happened. She tried to move up, but she tripped. It turned out she had at least, and broken her ankle or something, and so she tried to move up the hill, but it was pointless. Of all the pouring rain that had come down for the past 10 to 15 minutes or so, had made the entire the hill so slippery she wasn't even not able to walk up there because she tried at least 2 times, but always pulled back down. And she tried to maybe find another different way to walk in the behind it some long distance of the hill. But as she did, she slipped and fell down, and she fell in a creek, a small creek, and she lost her consciousness again. But luckily, her head ended up above the water, and it wasn't even pouring water. It was like a slowly small creek, but it was cold in the water. And the police firefighters and the EMEs, the medics, they searched entire forested area, but she they had asked Linda where exactly that she believed that she had lost her friend from almost like approximately area. She didn't exactly know where, but she thinks at least maybe after like 20, at least maybe it's after 30 to maybe, and she believed at least about 20 minutes from the start of the trail up to the hill. Behind some, there was at least a big rock to the right and a big pine tree as is next to it. She believed somewhere there could have lost her friend. So they went to this area and searched for nearly maybe at least 5 to 10 minutes there also. They screamed for Alan's name for answer, but the only good her hearing was the rain pouring and the thunder in the distance, but no answer from Alan. They were terrifying in themselves, realized what if, what if that she had been in such terrible accident and that she might be unconscious, which they were right. Because as they walked down the slope on the hill, which they believed that she could have ended up with, they found her in the creek, and she was really cold. The medics managed to take her up in the car to ambulance and take her home to the hospital. Ellen was still unconscious, cold enough. She barely could had any temperature heated. She has barely any pulse because of the cold water. Linda. She followed them back to the hospital and waited in outside in the waiting room when she called Brian, and she was hysterical. She literally cried and screamed at the same time into the phone, saying that Alan was in the hospital and the doctors may think that she has been suffering from her hypothermia and that her condition was very critical. And Karen, when she heard that on the phone, she freaked out, started crying, believing that she would lose her own daughter for this terrible accident. She didn't blame Linda for any of this because they didn't even know how bad the weather would be. They thought maybe these light rain would appear, but this bad weather sometimes happens. So Brian and Karen went to the hospital waiting for any update from the doctor. And Linda apologized over and over because she didn't have no idea what to do. But Brian told her, "You don't. This is not your fault. You couldn't even realize. You couldn't even know if this bad storm would be that bad, and you couldn't even realize that you didn't even know if your friend was behind her. I don't blame you." And Ellen, later on, she actually did. Ellen's doctor did left, went to the waiting room, maybe as up to 5 hours later, which almost felt like an eternity. But the doctor told Karen her daughter was okay, but she had to stay in the hospital overnight to try to warm her up a little slowly because she had been suffering from hypothermia. She asked if they could see her, and they said yes, but only for a moment. Karen was devastated to see her daughter in the hospital bed. Brian, despite he is a very brave, curious young man, but seeing his own girlfriend on the hospital bed, he broke down. But after about 2 days on the hospital, she woke up. And she had almost no memory of what happened until Linda had had filled in some of the details what happened. And then she started to slowly remember. And Brian was just happy to see that she was okay. After a couple of days, she was back home. All their friends from school was very happy to know that she was okay because they all had been informed what had happened. Even though, even though Brian was not much as there, but she knows how much he wanted to be there, but there wasn't much that he could have done. If he probably went there, he probably had hurt himself, but he said, "I don't care if I get hurt as long as you're okay." But she said, "But I would not be happy if you been hurt." But they both realized both had a good point. Both of them actually went back to their daily basic life again afterwards. They went back to school when the summer was over, and life between Brian and Ellen remained strong. He always made sure that she was safe, or at least make sure that nothing like this would happen again. Even though that if he had went with her to the hike on this same day as when she went with Linda, it is possible that in his mind that the outcome could have been very similar or a bit different. But he's at least happy she made it. Even though there were at some point when he believed that he would have lost his true love, and even though Linda herself was really happy though that she didn't lose her best friend, even despite knowing that Ellen was so close she could have lost her own life, but she was just happy though. And things between Brian and Ellen remained strong. They even went to the same college years later after they finished from high school. And Brian, he started working as a gym instructor because he was actually good at it. And Ellen, she started working as a preschool teacher in the same town where she lived in. And they both were actually happy. And after they had been together for about 8 years, Brian proposed to her in the park, and she said yes. Both was so happy to be in that Brian had actually took the question and asked her. Despite knowing that those years ago when he can almost have lost Alan, but knowing that she is still with him after all this time, he was just happy to be with her. And they even got married in a small ceremony in a church in the town. They even rented a small cabin there by the lake for about a couple of days for a honeymoon. And just 2 years later, Ellen announced to the friends and the family she was expecting a baby soon. Brian was super excited to be a parent, and they didn't realize they were having a son. They decided to name him Ryan after Ellen's deceased father. And after Ryan was about 4 years old, they're expecting another baby. They were actually expecting a daughter. They named her Caroline. Caroline was actually like her mother, really excited. And even though that Brian himself was really happy to have two kids with Ellen, because his love for Ellen remained so strong in over years. But their happiness would even take another turn. But surprisingly, when Ellen, when Caroline was about 3 years old, Ellen announced they were expecting another baby. They were expecting a boy, and they were really surprised about that. They decided to name the boy Tom. Tom after Brian's grandfather. Brian himself could not have been much happier to have three children with his beloved wife Ellen, and she could not have been more happy to be with someone like Brian. Their life together had remained solid, strong bond. If Brian never had told Ellen about his feelings, he would never had this much happiness, so much joy, seeing his own children with Ellen. And Ellen, though, She agreed. If she never had, even if he never met his feelings for her, she would never have experienced this true happiness of joy with Brian. In her mind, Brian is the most perfect, handsome young man that anyone should have in their life. She was just happy that she met Brian all those years ago when she and her mom, Karen, moved in next door. Even Brian, he was really excited that he actually met Alan the very first day. And this is how Alan and Brian are the true love, got a big family. The end.